So President Obama's speech today at the UN was the second speech of the day. The first one was given by the country that by tradition goes first at these things, which is Brazil. This year that was a little awkward because Brazil and the United States right now are having a fight. There was supposed to be a big official state dinner in Washington next month with President Obama hosting the president of Brazil. State dinners are a rare thing. It's the biggest honor that our country offers any other visiting head of state. But last week, Brazil called to say they didn't want it anymore. No, we are not coming to the state dinner. Thank you very much. They haven't even rescheduled it or anything. It is just canceled. The reason Brazil is mad at us is because of recent disclosures that even though we are close allies and friends with Brazil, our intelligence agencies have been spying on them. And not just spying on Brazil in general, but even specifically spying on their president's emails. So yeah, Brazil is mad at us. And this morning, it was Brazil's president giving her speech, upbraiding the United States for this totally unacceptable affront to the principles that should govern relations between countries. And that speech was followed immediately by the speech from President Obama. So that was an awkward start to the day. It's also a reminder, though, of the breadth of stuff that was leaked by Edward Snowden, the former NSA contractor who's now holed up in Russia after having delivered thousands of classified documents about various forms of American spying to Barton Gellman at the Washington Post and Glenn Greenwald at the Guardian. He leaked about the U.S. spying on Brazil. He leaked about the U.S. spying on China. He leaked about the U.S. spying on you and me, and how the whole architecture of American telecom is essentially tapped, or at least tappable, by U.S. intelligence agencies. And whatever you think about those leaks and the guy who did the leaking, it is kind of amazing that this guy who was not particularly accomplished in the intelligence world, this guy who didn't have any title of any consequence, who hadn't really risen through the ranks very far at all, he skipped around from job to job and contractor to contractor, this guy who did all of this when he was still in his 20s, he nevertheless had access to that huge breadth, that huge array of really sensitive material. Part of the reason he had access to that level of material was because he had a top secret security clearance. And you know what? Now, in retrospect, maybe it seems like he shouldn't have had that clearance. One of the things he admitted to after he started leaking was that he took his last job at the government contractor Booz Allen specifically to get access to more classified information, which he planned to hoard and then leak. So he's getting jobs in order to violate security and leak that stuff. The idea of a background check, a top secret security clearance background check, is not just to figure out who you are and if your resume all checks out. It's to find out if you are trustworthy, if you're going to pose any kind of security risk with this information you're about to be trusted with. Well, when he was being checked out for his clearance, were there any signs in his background? Did anything pop up among his character references that might suggest there was going to be any sort of security problem there? We will never know that because that check did not happen. The top secret security clearance background check that happened on Edward Snowden failed to talk to any of his coworkers at the CIA, failed to check with even one of the references that he listed on his questionnaire, failed to interview any of his neighbors from the time when he lived abroad, failed to look into a trip he took to India, which he did not report at all. NBC's Michael Isikoff obtained an official review of his background check, and it appears that basically the only people they talked to in checking out his background beyond him himself, for his own top secret security clearance background check, the only people they talked to besides him were his mom and his girlfriend. And wouldn't you know, they think he's awesome, no problems. He's dreamy. Turns out the same company that was responsible for doing that brilliant background check was also responsible for this guy's background check. The fact that Aaron Alexis had a secret-level security clearance, the fact that he had passed his background checks to get that clearance is absolutely critical to how he had a job with a Navy contractor and thereby got access to the Washington Navy Yard, where he killed 12 people last week. And now, over the last 24 hours, we are learning that Aaron Alexis passed that background check and got that security clearance in a way that is starting to look super, super sketchy. And thinking about this kind of background check, this kind of security clearance issue, what are the kinds of things that you'd think would trip up that process, that would send up a red flag, might interfere with you getting that clearance? Well, we know that he had fairly serious mental health issues. He was getting treatment for mental health problems at the VA. He admitted to police when they arrested him in Seattle that he had been in a rage-fueled blackout. His family corroborated his problems with anger also to the Seattle police. It ended up in the police report, them describing his struggles with mental illness. So maybe that would pop up on a background check. It is in the police report. Apparently not. We also know specifically that he was having paranoid delusions and hearing voices. And it's one thing if that's your own private Idaho and you're keeping that to yourself. But in this case, again, he disclosed that to police, and it ended up in another police report, this one in Rhode Island, where police officers, in their written and duly filed report on him, described in great detail the paranoid delusions and voices that he was hearing. He described himself to those same police officers as a Navy contractor. And the police not only wrote that down, too, they turned that whole police report over to the Navy to let the Navy know this hearing voices thing was going on with their contractor, who had access to Navy facilities. Did that ping anything for the background check? Apparently not. If you're being checked out for a security clearance and you're getting an official background check, even if they check nothing else, you think they're going to check your criminal record, right? Your arrest record? Well, yeah, it turns out in a way. After the shootings at the Navy Yard last week, turns out the Navy looked into what had happened in the case of Aaron Alexis and the background checks that cleared him for a security clearance. This apparently insane shooter who got a security clearance. How did that happen? The Navy released the results of that review late yesterday. And in what they released, we learned that the shooter's fingerprints pinged in the database to at least show one of the times that he was arrested. It was the first of the 2 times that he was arrested on gun charges, as it turns out. This is the time that he used a handgun to shoot out the tires of a car that belonged to a construction worker who he says he argued with. He did not report that arrest or that incident on his background check form, which itself is lying on your background check, which itself should be a red flag and should raise a problem. But apparently that was not seen as a problem. That arrest pinged anyway just because of his fingerprints. And when the people doing the background check found out about it, they decided they'd put a shine on it for him. So it wouldn't cause him any problems with his security clearance, the security clearance that got him into the Navy Yard where he killed 12 people. The background check, which was reported to the Navy, quote, left out the gun in its description of that incident where he shot out that guy's tires, saying instead that Aaron Alexis had just deflated the man's tires. Yeah, he did technically deflate them, but he deflated them by shooting them out with a handgun. The people doing the background check knew that, but they did not report it. Why would you excise that from this guy's record? Why would you drop the gun part of that if you are doing a background check on somebody for a security clearance? Why is the him shooting something part of this worth excluding from his background check, especially if you're also going to miss his mental health issues and him hearing voices and all of his other arrests and his Navy misconduct? They upgraded him shooting out the dude's tires to him deflating the tires, which, yeah, does sound better. And so, yeah, he passed his background check, and, yeah, he got his security clearance. And, yeah, we know how that ended last week. There's no reason to believe that the company doing the background check had any idea what Aaron Alexis was going to go on to do. There's no reason to believe they were, in cahoots with him and pulling off this massacre at the Navy Yard. There is, however, reason to believe that the company who did his background check did a terrible job. And on Edward Snowden's background check, also a terrible job, and it was the same company. When it became clear that both of those background checks were done by the same company, the Washington Post went out and found some former employees of that company who wanted to talk about what it was like to work there. Quote, some former employees describe an environment where people went weeks without seeing their bosses and handled sensitive documents with no supervision in their home offices and occasionally at Starbucks. The goal at all times, volume. Former employees say bosses simply trusted the employees to do the work in the right way with little oversight. Quote, I could go weeks and weeks and not see a single coworker, so there's no way they can see what you're doing, said one former investigator. In terms of this highly sensitive, confidential information they're dealing with for people's security clearances, quote, people were leaving their laptops at Starbucks, said one former investigator. People were leaving cases on top of their cars, information blowing off in the wind. We had a lady who left her files at Chuck E. Cheese with her kids. The firm is called USIS, and they are now under federal criminal investigation into whether or not they've been lying about the thoroughness of their work on people's background checks. According to NBC's Michael Isikoff, the grand jury in this case is specifically looking into allegations that the company pressured its employees to submit bogus reports in order to keep up with the volume of their work. Overall, more than 20 investigators have pled guilty or have been convicted of falsifying background check reports since 2006. In one case, an investigator claimed to have interviewed a person who had been dead for more than a decade. Oh, yeah, I definitely talked to that guy. I said everything was fine. That guy's been dead for over a decade. These contractors are the ones who do all the legwork, all the background checks to see if you get granted a security clearance by the U.S. government. the specific contractor company who did the background checks for Edward Snowden and the Navy Yard shooter, doesn't have a monopoly on doing this work, but almost. They did over $300 million worth of this type of business for the federal government last year. And I'm sure that is great business for them. They're owned by a private equity firm now. Do you remember Bain private equity, right? It's not Bain, but it's another firm like Bain. It's called Providence, is the private equity firm that owns them. But basically, this firm is guaranteed a huge revenue stream because they are handling 45% of all contracted background checks for the federal government. This one firm, which appears to be terrible at what they do. The idea that core government functions, like, say, figuring out who should get access to top secret information, the idea that core government functions can be done better for profit by the lowest bidder, that has been kind of a bipartisan mania in Washington for the last couple of decades. Contracting stuff out that you think would be done by the government or by the military itself, it did get very famous during the Iraq War with Halliburton and the no-bid contracts and all that. But this stuff was not born in the Iraq War. This stuff was the hallmark of the Clinton administration before that and the George H.W. Bush administration before that. USIS, this background checks company, it was created in 1996 during the Clinton administration, specifically so somebody could make a profit doing work that before then had been done by the government itself. And I'm sure the profit part of it has been a lot of fun. But the core government function they are supposedly taking responsibility for is apparently not really happening. This idea that contractors are always better turns out to be one of those bipartisan bad ideas. Does this mean we should start to grow out of it? Joining us now is a man who helped piece together this story, Michael Isikoff, NBC News investigative correspondent. Mr. Isikoff, thanks for being here.
Good to be with you, Rachel.
So we've just run through these instances where it seems like there are all these red flags about Aaron Alexis that were overlooked or minimized by USIS and the Navy. Are these the sort of red flags that only look red in retrospect, or are they the kinds of things that ought to have been a problem for his background check?
Well, look, it's very easy in hindsight to look back at an Alexis and say, why didn't you catch this? Why wasn't that spotted or identified early? And clearly, you got to sympathize with the Navy to some extent and perhaps even USIS. But that said, look at the details in this case. He's getting a secret clearance. A arrest record pops up. The USIS doing the background check doesn't pull the police report, which had all those really alarming details about the anger management problems that his father told the police about, suffering from PTSD, him telling the cops that he shot out the tires during a blackout, which he didn't remember because he was fueled by anger. All of that was in the public police report, and none of it was pulled by the background investigators for USIS. What they did was go ask him, hey, what about this? And how do you explain? We see that there's arrest here. All it said in the arrest record was malicious mischief. And he says, oh, I deflated the tires. And that's what they write down. I mean, it's kind of like basic reporting. You know, you go out and you get an account from somebody and then you sort of pull the record to check and see if that matches up. And here, it clearly didn't, but none of that got reported to the Navy. And by the way, leave aside the security clearance issue. Somebody with that background, with a firearms offense, who says he's suffering from PTSD and anger management and all that, you could raise basic questions whether they ought to be in the military in the first place. And this is a background check going on when he is enlisted in the Navy. So they're clearly, from the public record, we see there red flags there. And then you piece it together with all these other accounts. In some of those cases, and I was looking through the court files last week, you see investigators for USIS and in some cases other companies who were filing as many as 1,000 fraudulent reports with the Office of Personnel Management, claiming to have done interviews they never did, claiming to have checked records that were never checked. That's why you have people on Capitol Hill right now raising some serious questions about accountability.
That's right. The Senate in particular looking into, I think, the overall issue of contracting here and this contractor in particular. These red flags are stunning and very worrying. Michael Isikoff, NBC News investigative correspondent. Michael, thank you for your reporting on this. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Rachel.